Hello, everyone. I'm Corey Hanadel, and this is Bryson Terrell with me. So today we're going to talk about webhooks, which is a pretty new feature in the JSS. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Events API and kind of what that is. I'm going to tell you how webhooks became a thing in the JSS. And then from there, Bryson's going to talk about, as an admin, what makes webhooks so awesome. He's got some pretty cool slides to show you how you guys can get started using them. He's got a bunch of resources for you, and then we'll end with some questions. All right, so as I said, I'm Corey Hanadel. I'm a software engineer at Jamf. And in my time here, I've worked on Team Argonne, and we're the ones that that are working on patch management. And we're also the team that implemented webhooks. And also, I don't know if anyone got the update, but there's another patch session at 4, because yesterday I think a bunch of people ended up missing it, so remember that. All right, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about the Events API, kind of what it is. So unlike the REST API, I guess I'll start. Has anyone used the Events API? Oh, wow, okay. 2. Okay, 2 people. So what it is, it's an API that you can get real-time information out of the JSS. It's stateless, and unlike the REST API, it just gives you kind of a snapshot at that point in time. You can get information without the need of polling. It allows you to create your own plugins. So you can subscribe to these events, create your own plugin for it, put it in the JSS, and do whatever you want it to do. And it gives you the ability to act on actions in the JSS. So why do Events API matter with webhooks? Maybe not so much, but a lot of admins use it. It triggers on a lot of actions in the JSS that are useful for people. When a policy is run, recon, different things like that. And it's actually the backbone of webhooks. So when an event is triggered for the Events API, it actually triggers that same event for webhooks too, so they're tied pretty close together. So then, why webhooks became a thing? So like I said, I'm on the patch team, and during a lot of our demos with customers, there is one thing that we do where we give notifications if a new patch has been updated. A lot of them wanted a different way to get that notification. Instead of through the JSS or an email, they wanted to have their own something running. For instance, like HipChat or Slack, where all the admins that are in charge of patch could get a notification if something like Flash or Java has an update. So that was the driver with us doing it. So next, Bryson's going to talk about just how to get it all set up.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Hey, everybody. I'm not sweating because I'm nervous. I'm sweating because I came from the office over to here, so bear with me. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bryson Terrell, Desktop Services Specialist here at Jamf Software, so that's internal IT. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes webhooks insanely great, because webhooks are insanely great. So I'm going to come back a little bit here to Corey's question that we asked who's used the Events API. Show of hands here, who has heard about the Events API? Now let's switch that up to ask you, how many of you had a great idea to use that the Events API would let you do, but you couldn't because you didn't know anything about Java, or you're hosted and you had no path to actually get something up there in the Jamf cloud? Just show of hands there. So that question sort of ties back into what makes webhooks a really, really powerful new feature for the JSS as of 9.9.3. All right, so at the very core of it, webhooks are just HTTP requests. That's what they are. How many people here have used either the JSS's REST API or any other HTTP-based REST API? So right there, the bar to entry has just been substantially lowered because you already know how that works. You use curl or another library. You make a GET or a POST request. If you're doing a POST request, you attach XML or you attach JSON, and then it goes out, and then something processes that. We're really talking about just doing the same thing in reverse when it comes to webhooks as a framework, and this is true for any other service that provides webhooks. You are listening for that event coming in. It's going to be an HTTP post, and it's going to have data that you already know how to work with and process because you do it when you get responses from APIs. And like I said, with webhooks, it's JSON or XML. So if you don't want to work with XML anymore, you can just stick with JSON. And the big thing about that is that JSON and XML and then HTTP requests, those are language agnostic. Pick a language and it knows how to work with those types of requests and those types of data formats. And because it's language agnostic, that also means it's platform agnostic. You don't have to have your integration running on a particular platform. That doesn't just necessarily mean Mac, Linux, or Windows, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. And then here's the other really big kicker is the fact that it works with cloud and on-prem. Both cloud and on-prem installs have webhooks, which means if you write an integration that works for on-prem, it will continue to work with cloud in case you're either transitioning to cloud or something changes and you have to transition to on-prem. Anything that you write that works with webhooks as an integration is going to continue working. You don't have to worry about installing it on the server. And also, as Corey mentioned here, did we mention that it's real time? Webhooks are actions in response to changes in the JSS. So when an action occurs and a change happens, that fires off the event, and then you receive that event as it has happened, which is an entirely new dynamic when we're talking about writing integrations for workflows with the JSS and the data that's in it. I mean, how many people here have written a script or something that runs every 10, 30, 60 minutes to scrape a ton of data out of your JSS? And look at this guy nodding right over here. To scrape your JSS and then figure out what has changed. Now imagine if you didn't have to do that, and instead you got told whenever a change happened and which computer or mobile device initiated that change and what it was in context. The wheels are turning now. All right, so enough with that crap. We're actually going to talk about how to get started with this stuff. So, unlike past presentations of mine, I have one slide with code in this. I know. It's a Bryson presentation with only one slide of code. But we're not even going to get to that yet. I'm going to go over what the basic high-level overview of what webhook integration looks like. So we got three components right here. We got our clients out there in the wilderness. We have our JSS. And then somewhere, we have our integration running that's going to be listening for webhooks. So like I said, webhooks are events that are triggered on changes. So a change has to occur. And one of the most basic ones you can do right there is the computer check-in. That's an event. There are also mobile device check-ins. There's patch title update notifications. A bunch of stuff like that. So what's going to happen here is a client checks in, and that triggers this event. So what happens then is the JSS, if you've registered a webhook, and that's under, where are my notes? Settings, global webhooks. If you add a webhook for computer check-in and you give it the URL to your integration, when that computer checks in, an event is going to get fired off as an HTTP post to your integration. From that point there, your integration will now have a chunk of data. In the case of computer check-in, it's actually going to be a little shell record of that computer that initiated that check-in. So you're going to have things like the JSS ID, the serial number, the UUID, the MAC address, the username of the person who's attached to that computer, their full name, their email address, a really basic subset of data, which maybe that's enough data for you to work off of, or maybe you have to go back out to the JSS to do a GET to get some more data on that record. But regardless, at this point, your integration has the ability to go perform a bunch of auxiliary actions based upon what's received in. And that could be going out and talking to a directory service like AD or Open Directory. That could be talking to internal applications, things that other services or applications that you have installed in your environment behind your firewall, and your integrations behind your firewall, so it can freely go out and talk to those to get more information for whatever your workflow happens to be. Think about things like other management utilities that you work with in conjunction with the JSS, or other inventory platforms, or even things like, how many Atlassian customers do we have here? Got a few. So like that's something that could be either cloud or on-prem like the JSS. So maybe you have the Atlassian suite on-prem and you want to go talk up to those APIs. And on the flip side of that, there's also lots of web services, third-party web services. Think Google apps, or G Suite as they like to call themselves now. And yeah, that's funny too. And then Office 365, Dropbox, Box. You can make your integration, take the data that's come in, and if you need to go do lookups against a service for your workflow, it's able to go out through the internet, so you can just go interact with those APIs to get even more information. Then when you're finally done gathering all the information that you want to, you can then initiate the action if whatever criteria for your workflow is actually met. That could be things like going back out to the REST API to write changes. So here's a fun one. How many of you have a workflow where a computer submits an inventory report, and then, like during that inventory report, you have a script that runs on the client that checks for something, maybe it's through AD or whatever, and then it actually has some credentials so it can write extension attributes on the API. I got a few, and I've heard about that one before. In this example, you could offload that where computer check-in happens. It takes the username, goes out to your directory service, grabs that user out of your directory service, matches security groups that username is a member of, and then go back out over the API to flip extension attributes to drop that computer into scope for configurations and policies. That offloads the workflow from the client, which is something that has traditionally been done in some cases, and makes it a server-side workflow that's still happening every time that client checks in. Or maybe you're in a situation where you need a really robust email notification service. Now, the JSS does not really have a mechanism for notifying people outside of the administrators in the JSS to when computers or mobile devices drop in and out of smart groups or other conditions. And the other thing is that those emails are very basic. They just tell you this change happened in this smart group, and it's usually plain text. You could write your own integration where it does the checks for you when it comes in, and then if it needs to, it'll go out. And maybe you'll have a list, a distribution list or something. Then you can have a nicely rich formatted HTML email that goes out to these distribution lists in your org for things like compliance violations, or this Mac has not checked in for 30 days or something like that. Well, no, that's a bad one because that would be a poll. But for things like where you're listening for smart group changes and stuff, and then you're checking those group changes as they occur, you can then notify in real time as soon as a compliance violation happens. And that can be to any distribution list or user that you can match up by doing AD lookups or other directory lookups. Then lastly, the simplest one is the chat relay service. Webhooks come in, your integration processes them into the format that HipChat, Slack, or whatever uses, and then shoots it back out to the chat room or channel that you want to receive that notification. It's about the simplest that you can possibly make it. So, now we're finally going to get to the part where my one slide of code is going to show up. So there are really two ways of doing this, and the first one I'm talking about here is the build your own, where you actually just write an integration from the ground up, and you're going to put it somewhere to just listen for inbound webhooks. And this one's probably the most flexible of what you could possibly do because, again, you can do it in absolutely any language you want. I do all my stuff in Python. You can do it in Ruby. A little shout out to you there, Chris. PHP, if you're still on that bandwagon, .NET, if for some reason you have a really robust Windows development team, they know .NET, they could write integrations for you in .NET. You could still use Java, you could use Node.js, you can use whatever you want. And then going back to running it from any platform, it could run bare metal on a Mac or a Linux box or a Windows PC that's sitting in a corner, or it could be in a virtual machine if you've got virtualization infrastructure, or out in the cloud on a virtual machine, or out in the cloud on one of the many app services like Heroku, or even containers if you really want to go down that route, and anyone here has been playing with Docker containers. That's also an option. You have all the choices in the world when it comes to going this route. Then, of course, as always, it's your code, your environment, and you are in full control over what is happening in there. So to a lot of people, that's a huge bonus. And then, of course, this is probably the path of least resistance to tying into as many on and off-prem services as you need to for whatever workflows you've come up with. And for me, like I said, I use Python. For stuff like this, I always fall over to my preferred library, which is Flask. It's a web micro framework. And this is about as simple as it gets for a webhook integration. This is it. This is my one slide of code. Where's the laser? Whoa. Corey, you said there was a laser on this thing. You lied to me. There's the laser. So, at the top here, I'm using 3 libraries for this. I'm using Flask, which handles registering the routes that are going to be accepted coming into it and what methods are used. Then I'm using JSON and requests for the action I'm going to take. This right here is just a generic example of that chat relay I talked about, where a webhook comes in, and I process what I want from it into the format that the chat service would want, and then I shoot that back out. So right here, app route, I'm going to say the /inbound path is where I want these things to be received. I only accept post requests to that. And here's the function that gets triggered whenever something comes in on there. I grab the event data, which I set my webhook up to send JSON. Then I start taking some of the details out of it and then putting it into a dictionary here, which will get dumped to JSON over here. And then this request line right here is just to do a post to the chat service. And then once that's done, I return a 200 response code to the JSS to give it the, OK, everything's done. That is as basic as you can get. In fact, I think it's kind of the same for Ruby and most other languages that have nice little web frameworks for you to work with. These 2 lines down here, Flask contains a built-in server for testing and development purposes, so you don't need to do anything fancy to get this thing fired up and try it out. So right here, you can see that I've got on the top here the code, or just the terminal output for when I'm testing running it. And then the bottom is when I'm actually sending it some mock data to watch it react. And actually, I forgot to mention on this slide right here, this little app run line at the bottom right here, I'm saying the host is 0000. That just tells Flask to expose this on the IP address of the host machine. So that way, other external services external to my computer could actually access this by going to my IP address /inbound. Port 5000 is the default port that Flask runs over. And in case you ever start messing with this, just remind yourselves that any port below 1024 is reserved, so you have to use sudo in that case in order to fire up your Flask server, but it's above 1024, you don't have to use sudo. And then the debug thing there is just to get some extra output. So I mean, it's as simple as calling your Python interpreter where you have the Flask library, calling the code, and then you get some output right here telling you it's running, and then every time something hits any of your endpoints, you're going to see that show up as an action right there. So post on inbound, and it returned a 200 response code. This is what I'm doing right here. So I'm in another terminal session. I have Python open. I load up requests, and then I make a post of some mock data to my running plugin, and then it just processes. And this is the part about webhooks that's really, really easy to troubleshoot, because all you need to do is have an example of the data and post it to your integration while it's running. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, because you're just running it locally. So you can actually see it behave as it would if you had actually had the JSS do the post. So that's it. That's all the code in this presentation. But like I said, this is probably the most flexible, and as you saw, it's really easy to get going with it. But what about deploying things like this? Well, like I said before, that app is going to live on a box somewhere. It's going to live in a VM somewhere. It's going to live in a container somewhere. So you're going to need something to run it. Also, very, very important is that you don't just use the built-in Flask server or just the built-in server for any other framework for other languages. You want it fronted by an actual web server. I use Nginx for all my stuff. It's really simple. It's really easy to get started. If you know Apache, and a bunch of JSS administrators are in here, you probably do know Apache. You can use that. You can use that as the front end to your code. But then probably the most important piece is put an SSL cert on it. Or TLS is being a little technically correct there. Don't expose your plugin over HTTP. And this is where that inverse thing comes in. When you're at your computer and you make a GET or a POST request somewhere that starts with HTTPS, the server is handling the encryption of that. If the JSS makes a post request to your integration and it doesn't have an SSL cert, it's going to send it plain text. So I mean, like I said before, serial numbers, UUIDs, usernames, email addresses. You don't want that stuff going plain text over the wire. So put a cert on it so that way it's encrypted traffic. I really, really wanted to stress that point because it's easy to get into this, get started, and fire up a bunch of applications and realize you're not encrypting anything. So, what if you don't want to run your own server and you don't want to run a container, or you don't want to deal with any of that crap? There are serverless options. They actually do exist. So, let's take a look at going crazy with Amazon Web Services. Who here has an Amazon Web Services account for making use of like their cloud offerings? So we're going to talk about the Amazon API Gateway, and we're going to talk about Lambda functions, because these two pieces together are a super, super powerful combination. And this is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but you can get started with it. Like I said, it's serverless, so it doesn't take a lot of time to get stuff up and running and just going. And it's really, really powerful when you start digging into all the different Amazon services so you can tie into your workflows and this integration that you're building. I want to give a shout out to Joel Rennick. Is he in here? He's not in here. Wasn't actually sure if he was coming to the conference. But he's a Mac troll on Slack, and he's the one who pointed me at this after we launched Webhooks. And it's just really damn cool stuff. And I can distill this down to 3 text steps. Don't be deceived by that. So first off, use Amazon API Gateway to provide the endpoints that you will send your webhook traffic to. Easy. Then that endpoint will trigger a Lambda function, so it'll actually take the inbound data and pass it to Lambda. And then Lambda functions will perform the action. And then everything's good. It's done. 3 steps. Looks good in text. Let's actually see what that looks like with pictures, because I managed to expand it out to 12 slides. So step 1, assuming that you've accomplished step 0 and you already have an Amazon AWS account, and I'm not going to cover how to do that. There's a sign-up button somewhere. You go here, and this is at the AWS console, application services, API gateway, and then there's going to be a blue button that says create API. That brings you here. And you can actually see that we've got a lot of options here. There's new API, there's clone from existing API, then there's this really damn cool one called import from Swagger. Who's played with Swagger docs? Nobody's played with Swagger docs. That's fine. That's cool. If you ever do end up checking them out, they're just JSON or YAML files that define an API. So you can actually import that document, and AWS will build all the endpoints according to your Swagger doc. Very cool. In fact, the new Universal API plug is actually, if you go to the doc page, that's a Swagger document. So. We're going to leave that new API, give it a name, optional description, and then we're going to click Create API. Then, from this screen here, it's not doing anything yet. So we're going to go to Actions and Create Method. And it's going to be a post method. You can see here the default option is Lambda function. You've got a few others there, but you want to leave it at Lambda function. You're going to want to select the Lambda region because your functions can live in any of the Amazon regions, so that means you can actually, if you're global and you're concerned about latency, you can actually do something to deal with that by putting your functions in different regions. At this point right here, if you've never been in here and you've never created a Lambda function, this box is going to be yellowed out. And it's going to have a link that says you don't have any Lambda functions, would you like to go create one? So we've created our API. And if you have the function already, you can continue on. But in the event that you don't, you click that link. Now we're going to move over to the Lambda services. And if you're navigating there, that's the AWS console, compute, Lambda, and then a blue create a Lambda function button. So I actually skipped a little bit on this slide because when you first go here, you're going to get presented with a bunch of template options called blueprints. And blueprints are pre-packaged Amazon services, so it handles a lot of the policies between each of them. And that actually is a kind of a nice shortcut if you know exactly what you want. But if you're just getting started and you're just building something simple, choose, what did I choose here? Blank, yeah. Choose blank function. And then it's just going to bring you right forward and it'll have nothing bundled together. And for the purpose of this, blank function works perfectly fine. A little further down the screen after the template options, you're going to have this trigger right here. And where it says API Gateway, that'll be a little blank box. You click on it, there'll be a whole list of options available for you, but for the integration, what we want is when traffic comes into the API Gateway, we want the API Gateway to be the trigger for our function. So you click that, you then go here, there we go. So you then select that API you just created, and right here, deployment stage, I'm going to describe that a little bit more later, but odds are you won't be able to select anything here, so that'll just be left blank. Then this last part, security. There are security options for authentication, but the JSS has no mechanism for authenticating to an endpoint when it's doing a webhook event, so you have to leave this as open. Now this is where it gets fun because you scroll down a little bit, and I kind of lied. There is code on this, but if you look closely, this is the same code from my little Flask example with one exception. So there's a gotcha with Lambda functions here. And here is the gotcha. You can pick from 4 languages. You can pick Python guy, I have Python up here. Or you can pick Java. Or you can pick Node.js. Or you can pick a slightly older version of Node.js. There. Those are your 4 options with Amazon Lambda. It's actually Node.js 4.3, I think is what the other option is. Those are your 4 options, and odds are most of the people in this room aren't going to know. Well, actually, raise your hands. Who here has been playing with Node.js? So odds are, if you want to go this route, you're probably going to be getting into Python first. So the big change here that you see here is that I'm not using requests now. I'm using URLib2. I'm doing that because URLib2 is in the standard library. Everything that's in the standard library for Python is available through here with no extra work. So all these extra lines right here, I took that one requests line and I broke it up into the 4 lines I needed to actually use URLib2 to make my post request. Now, you can use third-party libraries. That gets more complicated because you have to build a virtual environment on your machine, install all the libraries into that. You then need to package up all that, and then you need to zip it together with your code, and then upload it all to here. Or there's a command line interface for doing that that they provide as well, but that's more complexity. If you can do your stuff in the standard library, no extra work is needed. You write it in your editor, and then you copy and paste into here. And you can see down here, I'm still returning nothing for the function. Just like in the Flask one, I was returning nothing, but I was also returning a 200 because I need to define the status code in Flask. But for the API gateway, it'll just return 200 response. I just need to tell it I'm not giving it any data back to give back to the requester, which is the JSS. Wow, I owe so many dollars, don't I? I keep saying JSS, it's Jamf now, Jamf Pro. So we're going to scroll down a little bit more because this section comes right after that. Lambda function handler enroll. For the really basic stuff, you don't need to worry about this actually. You can just leave the handler the way it is. For the role, leave it at that option, create role from template or templates. Then just give it a name that easily identifies that it was for this Lambda function. And then when you get down to policy templates, leave it blank. Because you're not going to be interacting with anything else that's inside Amazon's cloud offerings. You're not going to be connecting to a database or anything else. So you don't need any policy templates right there, so you can just leave it blank. Advanced settings down here, you can leave this the way it is. Try not to increase this timeout. You could even dip it down a little bit more if you want. You want to not increase that too much, because if you get a large queue of events pending in your JSS to go out and they're waiting for other ones to clear at your endpoint, if you increase the timeout, that's going to slow performance. So leave that either at 3, or you can even bump it down a little bit if you really want to. And then after you save it, your function's there, and your function is ready, but Lambda functions have this really cool thing where you can actually test your function. There's a blue test button right at the top of where it shows your details for your Lambda function. And if you click that test button, you're going to get this pop-up. And this pop-up will let you use a bunch of sample code or sample data that covers a lot of Amazon services, but you can just copy and paste right into here mock data for whatever webhook event this Lambda function is supposed to process. So you just paste it in here, and at the bottom there's a save and test button. You click save and test, and then it'll give you a pass-fail. And if it fails, it'll tell you what went wrong with your code. So super powerful tool of Amazon Lambda functions right there. All right, finally, we're past all that. We now have a function. We're going to go back to the API gateway, go back to our post method, and now we can actually put the function in here and click save. And it's going to prompt us that we're giving API gateway permission to execute the Lambda function, which you're going to hit OK to. And we're not done yet. There's still another step here where we need to actually go deploy the API finally, because the API is there, it's linked to our function, and all the pieces are there, but it's actually not exposed yet. So back to the Actions menu, go down to Deploy API. And remember earlier we saw that stage name for the Lambda function. This is where that comes into play. So if you have a stage in there, you'll have a drop list where you can pre-select your stage or select your already created stage. But if you don't, this is where you'll create it. And this also is another really powerful, really cool feature with using Amazon API Gateway, is the fact that you can have numerous stages. So for your actual live running integration, you can create a prod stage, which is what I'm doing here. Stage name is prod, description is just prod, and I didn't type anything else in there. But you can also have development stages or other test stages. So you can make new Lambda functions and tie to those stages, and you can hit those from another JSS or otherwise to test out new workflows before actually making them go live in prod. So super cool, super useful feature that's actually not that complicated to use. So once you've done that, finally the API is live. We're at step 12 now, and finally it is live and it's running. And right here, we have our URL finally exposed. And you'll notice that it randomly generates an ID for us right here. So it's randomly generated ID.execute-api. The region that we created in, .amazonaws.com/prod. So after the slash comes the staging area that we deployed to, and then whatever endpoints after that you configured. Also note that this does cut out one thing for you, which is everything with Amazon is already behind SSL. They handle that, so that means traffic to these endpoints will be encrypted by TLS. So like I said, that's not the simplest thing in the world, but it's serverless, and it gets a lot more extensible because you can create functions that go back to like Amazon RDS to write to databases to keep track of things. It can get really, really powerful. Unless you're a super large environment doing tens of thousands of webhooks out to these endpoints, it's not going to cost you that much money. Do you happen to remember what the costs are? I think Yonk described them to us, but it's like really, really low on their per request and per Lambda execution. I think your code for functions is actually time-based, and then with the gateway, it's per request. But like, you have to do a lot of requests in order to actually get a decent bill from Amazon for all this. So that makes it an attractive option as well. So now I'm going to leave you with some links to some resources here. If you were in the advanced API session yesterday, you might have saw that I actually have a landing page on the unofficial JSS API docs, where I actually have a page that details all of the current events in the with webhooks, and then the JSON and XML shells. So you can copy and paste them and use them for mock data if you want, and you also know what to expect for each one. If your interest has been piqued about Flask and you're already experimenting with Python, right here we got the official docs for the Flask framework right there. And then this right here, this blog, the Flask mega tutorial, that's how I got started with learning Flask. That's how I got to know how it works and building out applications using Flask. It's a really powerful tutorial. It's a little old at this point, but almost all of it still applies, and it takes you from headless endpoints to some GUI using HTML and Jinja templates, and then also a library called Flask SQL Alchemy, which allows you to have a SQL database for a backend. Super good stuff. Right there, the documentation landing pages for Amazon API Gateway and Lambda. Suggest you go check those out if you're also interested in going that route. And then lastly, when we launched 993, I posted a bunch of Flask-based examples on my GitHub at example JSS webhooks. Chris contributed to it, as well as one other user who was Chris Ostermeyer. He committed a PHP processing example. So if you want to get some ideas of some of the things you can do with webhooks and look at some example code, that's a great place to go. And on that note, if you want to join me back up here.
Thank you very much, Bryson. So today I learned that webhooks aren't used in phishing scams. I'm very impressed. So for the audience, which movie would you be watching if you heard lambda, lambda, lambda used that many times? Revenge of the Nerds, thank you. Not that I'm saying anything about you.
Not from you, Charles, no.
Yeah. All right, so the first question that we had on the old Twitters was, where can I get a patch shirt?
Number one new swag item.
Yeah, we've heard that quite a bit.
That we have.
Not for sale yet.
So another question, will this session be available on the internet? Yes, we need to fix sound levels and things of that nature, but we'll obviously be posting all of these. We're recording them right there. Hi, Ma. So with that, are there any good repositories that have webhooks that are pre-made and available today?
Not generic ones, no, but I wholly encourage you guys to start writing some.
So any good Swagger docs for Jamf Pro? That's pretty much what you just said. Same thing. Which is the best USS Enterprise?
The A. Why is this up for discussion? It's the A.
No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Is that Tom?
Relics was a good episode.
All right, back on track. So best practice to communicate with legacy machines pre-10.7 since we can't install the new Jamf binary on them.
If they're still checking in and still submitting inventory, if you're still able to get them to do that, like the webhook events don't care what's causing the event, it's just going to act on the event. Or is this a more generic question about best practices for managing legacy machines?
Best practice around managing legacy machines, I would say.
Update? No, that's a horrible answer. I would actually just recommend reaching out to your TAM and talking to your TAM about that.
Because that's kind of a per-case basis of what you need
That's definitely a
specifically.
per-case basis.
Yeah. And then I believe we have one more question coming in from one of my fellow podcasters. Can I bug Bryson to make integrations for me? So as the Director of Professional Services, I would be happy to sell you Bryson's time. I'm not
don't work for you,
100%
Charles.
sure that Bryson will deliver what I sold you, but you know.
Ouch.
I would say that you can hire us to do these things.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't think you can hire Bryson specifically, regrettably, unless I could talk him into transferring to my team, which we'll have beer about
We're
later.
negotiating salary offers for that.
And then the first question we had, which is very important, is can we get some carpet squares and goldfish since we're sitting on the floor and maybe a juice box? So to that, my response was that yes, you can have Swedish fish, but neither of the other two. So this is Minnesota, you know.
Yeah.
So with that, again, this is exactly what I was hoping for, you know, when I first talked to you about this, and thank you guys so much. And thank you. Any hands up? People that don't have Twitter, you should be embarrassed if you don't. Oh no. I'm
Any
kidding.
live questions? Star Trek trivia?
Oh, go ahead.
This isn't really a question, just a pitch for my own code. The Ruby JSS library has a webhooks framework now built into it that will spin up a server and serve your webhooks in the browser.
That's true. Ruby JSS has the webhooks module built into it, so you can get started if you're a Ruby fan.
Rich Trout.
Rich?
For those folks using Autopackager and Slack, if you want to get an idea of how useful webhooks can be, there is built-in integration for a webhook for Autopackager that will send into Slack the messages from Autopackage, including what packages got built, what got downloaded, anything you want, and you can send it to a specific Slack
That was Rich Troughton in front of Team Argonne mentioning that there is a auto package webhook environment that maybe they could have used or something of that nature.
We've heard it. Yep.
Anyone else want to plug some stuff? Go ahead.
Any provision for making the name of the day actually fail on a non-TLS connection?
So the question was a
I'm
provision
gonna let Corey
to
handle that one.
make queries fail for non-TLS based connections.
So right now it won't. It will fail if you try to do HTTPS over, like a bad cert. It'll fail over that, but HTTP it won't. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, thank you all so very much for sticking around, and we look forward to having you in the next sessions.
Yeah, thanks
Have
for
a
coming,
great day.
everyone.